Christine Wentz, welcome to In Focus.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you. I mean, my goodness, one of the founders of the iconic Onion.
I'm not a founder.
No?
I'm not a founder
No?
of the Onion. I worked.
How do you describe it?
Well, my roommate founded the Onion, actually. Tim Keck, who I knew from my freshman year in the dorms at UW-Madison, and his friend Chris Johnson were the ones who founded the Onion.
Got you.
But Tim asked a bunch of his friends to be a part of it, and he knew that I was a writer and was interested in journalism and all that stuff. So he actually originally hired me to be the art director. I think I was 19 years old, and I didn't know what that was.
Yeah.
But I actually became the copy editor. But yes. But anyway. But that's where I.
But you were involved with it in terms on the ground level, getting.
Yeah, absolutely. I was there on day one, through into the next couple of years. But I didn't have anything to do with the Onion becoming famous. But I did want to write about the Onion becoming famous.
How in the world did the idea start? Do something like that.
Well, Tim had done this sort of other publishing venue with a friend of his, a cartoonist named James Sturm. I actually just bought one of Sturm's books here about 10 minutes ago.
Oh, and I should say, we're in Arcadia Books here
we're
in
Arcadia
Spring
Books.
Green. This is, you're from Spring Green.
I grew up in Spring Green, yeah. I went to high school here. I lived here from age 4 through 17. So I went K through 12 right here in town.
And how does it feel to be back home?
It's nice. Yeah, I was walking around a few minutes ago and was like, wait, I haven't been here in a couple of years, I don't think, even though I live in Madison now. And it was nice because because everything is I have many, many years of memories all over the place. So it's fun to kind of walk through that.
And do you feel like your Spring Green, your days on the mean streets of Spring Green, taught you anything about funny and taught you anything about humor and that sort of thing?
I think that, that's an interesting question. My time in Spring Green wasn't really about comedy. It was about being, I was like one of the like punk rock new wave kids, like one of like 5 of them, in the entire Tri-County area or whatever. And what I did learn about, I think, was like looking at society from kind of the outside and in a kind of a different way, like through the art lens of kind of art and, music and that kind of stuff. So when I went to Madison, then I sort of found my people and, went on from there.
So you ended up getting involved with the Onion and you kind of knew nothing about stand-up comedy or humor and that sort of stuff? Or?
No. I grew up, like my dad had a subscription to National Lampoon, which he would like hide, and I would find it and bring it out again. I actually grew up out in the country about 8 miles outside of town most of the time. And I had a very long bus ride. And I used to read like Woody Allen books on the bus and like laugh my head off for like the 45-minute bus ride, and things like that. So, my dad had a good sense of humor. He was sort of a practical joker a little bit. So there was like some of that stuff happening in the house all the time. And my parents definitely encouraged, looking at things, through the lens of humor when there were difficulties, I think. So, yeah.
And what do you remember about your roommate in terms of how he came up with this whole idea?
Well, Tim had been working on this calendar thing that he was doing with Sturm. Sturm drew the pictures and Tim sold ads to attach to it. And basically, he needed to like make some money. He was like running out of money. And he didn't want to get a regular job. So and the thing about Tim, that's really important for the story, and this is, I outlined this at the beginning of the book, he actually came from a newspaper family, like a major kind of Chicago area newspaper family. His dad was an editor at the Hammond Times of Hammond, Indiana, and his mom was one of the first environmental investigative reporters there. So he grew up in a super saturated newspaper environment. And so when he needed to make some money, at the time there were like 1 billion free newspapers all over Madison. It was like sort of the social media in a weird way of the time. And so it was very natural to Tim to be like, well, maybe I'll start a newspaper, right? But the thing is, he didn't know what to put in the newspaper. He just wanted to make the newspaper. So it started out, unlike many publications, it started out like he just needed to make some money. And then it was like, oh, we got to put something in it. And then a friend of mine, I introduced my friend Matt Cook, to Tim, and Matt was an improv comedian at a place called the Arc Improv in town, and Matt was a good friend of mine also. And so Matt was like, why don't we just make it all up? And Tim was like, that's a great idea. So that's what we did.
Wow.
So yeah, that was the genesis
What
of
could
it.
go wrong just making it
Yeah,
up?
we'll just make it up. Yeah, I mean, there's no like. It's funny because sometimes people think there's some, very like a high level, concept, but I think it came up very spontaneously in response to a lot of stuff, and everybody was like 20, so I mean, we were just like babies working on this.
And there's
Yeah.
probably a generation out here now that aren't familiar with The Onion, maybe.
Yeah.
How would you describe The Onion newspaper?
Well, it was a newspaper for one thing. Remember newspapers? It's like, made of paper and it's on newsprint. It's news on paper. No, it was a weekly, and it was there was a very intense grind to like produce that thing every week, and a lot of it was written at 3 o'clock in the morning, before they'd had to go to the printer at 5 o'clock in the morning, kind of thing. So there was a lot of kind of spontaneousness in there, and lots of freedom, and the first, it was almost a zine in a way at first because it was very free form. But the thing from day one, though, it was always meant to be funny, but it never pointed to itself as comedy, right? So people would pick it up and be like, what is this? Like, what are these very strange stories? And people would try to kind of fit it into their existing paradigm and get like, oh, it doesn't fit, and so that was fascinating to people, and every issue was different, and so people started picking it up, and it became successful like almost right off the bat. So
Yeah.
so Tim was able to pay his rent like very quickly after that.
So now, is there anything symbolic in the name in terms of, onions, and onions make people cry, and crying is what people do when they laugh hard
Yeah.
enough, and all that kind of stuff? Is it anything to the name from that standpoint?
Nope. I mean, Tim swears up and down, and I've asked him several times, like, is this really the story, Tim? And he's like, yes, it's really the story. So the story is that nobody had any money, like everyone's living on like peanut butter and jelly, but apparently he and his partner, Chris Johnson, ate a lot of onion sandwiches. And one day, Chris's uncle was there, and he's like, they were trying to come up with a name for the paper. They were like, maybe we'll call it The Paper, and maybe we'll call it The Rag. And his uncle was like, why don't you call it The Onion? And they were like, sold, right? And like, that was it. I've looked online. Sometimes people are like, oh, The Onion is a name for like a multi-layered news story. And I'm like, no. Then I don't know where that stuff is coming from. Like, there's no, it doesn't mean like layers of meaning or anything. It's basically a spontaneous thing, like many things happened that first year.
So 1988, first headline goes up. I forget the headline. I thought it was something in Mendota. What was it?
Mendota Monster Malls Madison.
Yeah. Yeah. So how long did it take before things caught on, and this was like the paper to kind of get your hands on?
I don't know exactly, but it was pretty fast. I mean, even now, people come up to me and remember like issues from that first year. I think that remember about The Onion, and I talk about the business side of The Onion actually a lot in the book. They needed it to like support itself, and they needed it to, give them a little bit of extra money to like make their rent and stuff. So, I mean, my memory is that it became, it was, the students were mostly reading it, but it became successful like pretty quickly. I mean, Tim describes it as being like almost immediately it was successful, right? And then they were like, uh-oh, now we have to keep doing it, right?
Yeah.
So it was successful right away, which was interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm going to grab my little prop here because
Okay.
You mentioned the word book, and as people listen and watch this, one of the reasons we're talking to you because you spent 6 years on writing this.
Yeah.
Funny because it's true. And what, first of all, even made you want to dive in to tell the story of The Onion? What made you? What caught your attention?
I first thought of this when I lived for about 20 years on the East Coast. I was in New York and Boston for a long time. And I moved back here in about 2017. And you think of, I went to college here, and like naturally I started thinking about The Onion. It was during the first Trump administration, and on a particularly interesting news day, I was, listening to NPR and going, wow, I wonder what the Onion people think of all this. Because I hadn't thought about The Onion really. I hadn't paid much attention to The Onion for myself for a long time. Um, and I also, and then when I started Googling around, I also discovered that there was actually a lot of information online about The Onion The Onion's history that was actually pretty inaccurate. And, you know, I had done graduate work in history and I'd been a journalist in the past. So I was like, wait a minute, like I can't, you know, we can't all die and have no one, you know like the actual story of The Onion, right? So, and I know that, you know, the history is written by the people who, you know, were able to write it down. And what's, you know, the historical record is not necessarily accurate sometimes. That's one of the things you learn when you study history. So it was partly, you know, trying to make sense of what was happening at the time. There, you know, remember there was all this talk about fake news and all this kind of stuff. So those combination of two things like made me want to write the book. So
Yeah, and after I spent the last week or so, you know, doing my best to get through this book, and I got through it probably about 2 hours before we sit here and talk. But it seems to me that it's a great kind of account or evolution of, you know, where The Onion started, how it started, and kind of what it involved into. What was your thought process in terms of how you put it together and what you were trying to tell?
Yeah. So I realized early on that the history of The Onion is also the history of media since the 80s, the history of news and the media. In order to satirize something well, you have to really understand it. And I realized that, I'm going to need to learn more about this the history of what they were satirizing, the history of what they were doing a parody of, because everything is in a context, and I didn't want to tell the story like in isolation of the world The Onion was existing in, and so it was really important to me to also have it be. It's kind of like a stealth media history as well, and I talked to media scholars and that sort of thing to kind of flesh it out and make sure I was like on the right track and that kind of thing. So I'm hoping that people will sort of by osmosis also, you know, understand that there's a reason why we have the media that we have now, and you know this story in a weird way will kind of help you understand that.
Yeah, you also talked about some of the local weekly papers in the Madison area.
Yeah.
How do you think that influenced the work that The Onion did?
Well, there's they first The Onion was not produced. It was people think of it as a campus newspaper, but it was independent of campus. However, its primary competitors were the local campus newspapers, which were the Daily Cardinal, which was like the left-wing paper, and then the Badger Herald, which at the time was like the right-wing paper. And Tim, you know, one of my interviews with Tim Keck, he explains that, you know, the Cardinal was there were things about the way that they presented their politics that were, you know, it wasn't always appealing to folks, even if they like agreed with them, right? And then on the right wing, this was sort of the beginning of like the Young Republicans. There was a lot of really just disgusting and abhorrent and like awful stuff that was being published in the right-wing student newspaper. And so as Tim describes it, he's like, everybody, you know, people didn't really like either one, right? So The Onion, you know, sort of went into the middle of that, and it was like an alternative to the college papers.
I thought it was interesting reading. You talked about it was important for The Onion to look like a real newspaper, like they looked at USA Today and some national publications and kind of stole some of the ideas and not ideas, but the look.
Exactly.
Now, why was that important for them?
So this was a few years down the road. It took a good probably 5-8 years for The Onion to kind of find its mature style, if you can call it that. And when they went from black and white to color, in around like 94, 95, they really wanted to go like all out with this is like a complete sort of reproduction of like a real newspaper. So writing everything according to very strict AP style was really important. Kind of borrowing the components of USA Today, like the graphics and the page layout and, you know, the way that headlines worked and that kind of stuff. They really wanted it to be very much exactly like a real paper. They loved it when people thought it was real. And part of the reason people would think it was real was because it was such a brilliantly done like reproduction of a real newspaper.
Yeah, I remember this section you wrote about one of the folks that worked there. They said they would go to the Union and just kind of hear people talking about it, and they love nothing more than to hear someone talking about one of their headlines as if it was real.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they got a big, the 90s staff, especially the people who kind of created what we think of as the Onion's voice. They were always they were always very entertained when people thought the Onion was real.
And I also, as I read about this evolution of the paper and the staff, I got the impression that not many of them really had a background in comedy or humor in a professional sort of way. How is that possible? How did they pull that off?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, they were writers. You know, they were. A lot of them had been at the Daily Cardinal, and I should underline that. Like almost everybody had very strong progressive values, but they wanted to express it in a different way. So a lot of them had actually been cartoonists at the Cardinal. So they were also used to expressing things in a visual way, and the visuals of the Onion are really important. But I would say, I don't know, it was like everybody was very well read. Everybody was very intensely like self-educated, you know, it was just normal to sit around and talk about, you know, books and music and, you know, that was just what everybody was doing. And they had, I think that they had some of them at least had values they wanted to express through their satire, and that's kind of how all that stuff kind of mixed together. But they were not that original crew. I'm thinking of the '90s crew. Were not at all like, you know, ambitious. You know, we want to be famous. Like none of that was really happening. They just wanted to write like really good satire. Yeah. So
now here's something that stood out to me when I literally from the first chapter.
Yeah.
None of your chapters have names. That was so, to me, I felt that was so Onion-like. I don't know if that's purposeful. Are you just being lazy? Why are there no chapter titles?
I did have chapter titles originally, but we just decided to not do it. One of the things I've learned.
It just seems like an Onion thing to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like sort of stripping it down, and you're presenting it very straight, you know. And I also wanted people to, you know, not go into it with like your interpretation being sort of directed, you know, by the name of the chapter. Like it's let's just read it and see what happens. And it also kind of made it more like a novel, I think.
Yeah. I found each chapter to be, I guess, a different evolution of where the you know the paper was, where the team was, where some of the friendships and some of the business relationships were and were not. I also got this great sense that there is this divide between the creative side and the business side. What was that all about?
Well, that's like kind of the classic thing that happens in many organizations, the creative versus the business and how those interact. I guess the sort of, I'm trying to think of a short way to say it. Early on, editor Scott Dikkers and business manager Pete Heisey, who were two of the three co-owners of the Onion at that time, they decided to erect a firewall between business and editorial. So basically, business did whatever it wanted, editorial did whatever it wanted. And that was really important. But later, when the Onion got much bigger, after it went on the internet in '96 and became super famous, in 2001, Dikkers sold out his shares in the Onion to an investor. And then in 2003, Heisey did the same. And so after that, the Onion then became like an investment, you know, it became like a thing that the owners, you know, I mean, they loved the Onion and wanted to keep it going, but the business had like a different kind of paradigm at that point. And so the Onion, you know, became a thing that had to make somebody a lot of money. And the satirists, being who they were, that resulted in some like pretty intense clashes. Yeah.
I also thought it was interesting, and it actually made me laugh because again, you kind of bring this historical kind of a vantage point in terms of how you tell the story. Yeah. I thought it was interesting that you talked about there was just like a standard of what an Onion joke kind of contained. Do you remember what those what the pieces of that were?
Well, there was what's interesting, the Onion's process is what's interesting to me, and that made me like kind of gain a huge amount of respect for how they work. They're the Onion's known for like its headlines, right? There's a This American Life episode that takes place in the Onion writers' room. So basically, every writer would come to the meeting with like 20 headlines, and so they all get put together and they all kind of pick a few. But basically, it's sort of like for every 100 headlines, like maybe 3 or 4 get in. And so there's this very intense process that kind of helps the quality stay really high. I think that's one of the reasons the Onion's, like, people still read it after like 35 years or something, almost going on almost 40 years, which is amazing to me. And then part of the reason that is still happening, I think, is because of their process through which they write their headlines and write their stories is kind of designed to keep the quality high.
I also got a sense that a lot of its success was kind of just happened, like wasn't really planned. It's just kind of the way things went. I even heard, I read somewhere in there, someone described it as a house of cards.
Yeah,
that could go down. How did that work?
Well, that I understand that as the business side of it. Was, I mean, the Onion, there was this funny period in the 90s when the Onion was starting to get famous after they went on the internet. But the Onion's business was still like a local Madison business, right? So the editorial side is, getting profiled everywhere. They're being written up in the New Yorker, and Anderson Cooper's coming out to interview them and all this kind of stuff. And yet the Onion's business is like, like selling pizza ads, And so the writers were like, we don't understand, like, why isn't this business part getting bigger? But the business part, I think it was actually run, decently for what it was. They made a profit enough to pay everybody. They kept the thing in business. But that sort of, I don't know, clash is a maybe too strong of a word. But it was a very strange schizophrenic feeling, I think, for them a lot of the time. But the House of Cards was the idea that, one, they could also be like sued out of business at any time, because as the Onion got bigger, they also, would attract the attention of people who didn't think some of the jokes were very funny. And so like there was that too.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I love reading about the part, speaking about the internet age.
Yeah, yeah.
And the internet comes around in the late 90s, I guess. And so now you've got a choice or they've got a choice to go out and get a domain name.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're like, oh, that's going to cost $400. Do we want to spend that kind of money on something like that?
Yeah,
and people have newspapers and this and that. And but they took the leap of faith in that, and that probably ended up changing the game for them.
Oh yeah, no, it was huge. It was huge because at the time, this is 95. I think 96 is when the website actually started. And at the time, if people remember, the internet hype in the 90s, people were, it was easy to be skeptical about like where it was going to go, what effect it was going to have. Publications in general were like, we don't really like, how do we do this, you know? And the Onion wasn't any different than a lot of other, real newspapers that were also trying to figure out how to go online. But when they did, the Onion was kind of one of the only humor sites on the internet, and by that point they'd been working on their thing for years, and so they appeared there sort of fully formed, and it took off just like immediately, like almost a matter of weeks, as I understand it. They just kind of went supernova.
Yeah, because without the internet and that sort of thing, I'd imagine all the other great things that happen, some of the big books.
Yeah, exactly.
The television network, and some of those kinds of partnerships. I guess those things probably don't happen without going into the internet like that. Like where did it grow from? Because at some point they end up moving, to New York City.
Yeah, so as part of the .com boom that was happening at that time, the Onion did go through a period of trying to sell itself, so like, pets.com is getting zillions of dollars, and all these sort of like URLs are getting tons of money for being sort of concepts. But there's a kind of what I think is a pretty funny part of the story where they've got a representative going out to California and they're trying to sell themselves as a website, and nobody wants to buy them. And so they decided to go to New York when they were going to probably be bought by Comedy Central, which was new at the time. This is 1999, I think. And then that deal unfortunately fell through because the dot-com bubble burst, like literally at the same time, like in the same month that they were trying to finish this deal. And so that didn't happen. Everybody thought they were going to New York, and they were like, so you know what, we're just going to go to New York anyway. So they just took themselves to New York. In 2001.
What are some of the headlines you remember? Do you remember some of the headlines some of your favorite ones?
I think there's just been so many. There's just like thousands of them. I like the silly ones a lot of the time. One of my favorites is I can't even say it without laughing. Archaeologists discover ancient race of skeleton people. That's definitely one of my favorites. I wanted to be an archaeologist when I was like a little girl in rural Spring Green. So anyway, yeah.
The one I remember vividly was Mother Teresa sent to hell in screwy mix-up. I don't know if you remember that one.
Yeah, I don't think I remember that one. But why did you like that?
And there was another one. I forget the actual number, but it was like 394 voted favorite pin number.
Yeah. That's like their sort of slice of life style of joke.
Yeah. So we move past the TV shows. A few books have come out. There's some money coming in, and Onion's kind of probably maybe even on an international level at this point.
Yeah.
And then I guess somewhere in there, they decide that they want to shut down the New York office and move things to Chicago. That creates a little kind of drift between some of the staff.
Yeah.
But even that still turned into something probably good for the Onion.
Yeah.
Describe that period for us.
Well, that was a big deal because everything was going really well in New York. But at the time, the business office was in Chicago and the editorial office was in New York. So they were having a lot of problems with games of telephone, back and forth and trying to get everybody on the same page. And the business office decided that, look, it doesn't make any sense for a business, working at this level to have two offices, especially one in a really expensive neighborhood. And at this point, the original New York office was in a much cheaper neighborhood, but now they were in Soho in a really expensive, I'm sure their rent was crazy. So they announced that they were going to shut down the office, but it was very, very controversial. And there were news articles about it at the time. But the Onion editorial staff sort of put together kind of a rebellion of sorts and tried to find another buyer for the Onion. Baratunde Thurston was a leader of some of that. And they wanted to find some way to keep the Onion in New York, and were fought tooth and nail. But in the end, it all kind of fell through when an editor that had been gone for a while came back and said, no, I'll be the new editor in Chicago. And so then they did move to Chicago. But it was a big deal because about 85% of the staff quit. So they had to kind of start over again with a much smaller group of people in Chicago.
Yeah, and the organization's been bought and sold a few different times. Was it owned by Elon Musk at one point?
No, well, I think Elon Musk apparently, I don't have all the details on this, but Elon Musk did apparently at one point was in the running to buy the Onion. There were a lot of people. That's one of the things I learned through this process. It's interesting because in the 2010s, especially the Onion became like a lot of other media companies. And got bought and sold and was trying to kind of cope with the internet kind of advertising paradigm, and the way Facebook was altering how revenue worked and that kind of thing. But yeah, at one point Elon Musk was apparently in the running, but he did not buy the Onion, but he did take a couple of Onion staffers. He hired them away to do like he wanted to make his own kind of comedy website, but it didn't go very far.
Yeah. And so most recently it was bought a couple of years ago.
Like last year. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
still based in Chicago.
Yep. Still based in Chicago.
And I think just recently reintroduced the
Yes.
newspaper form?
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they're back in print again. They finally are sort of freed from sort of corporate. I was going to use a bad word, but
No bad
but
words
I
on
won't.
PBS.
It's PBS. I can't use a bad word. They were bought by a guy named Jeff Lawson, who was also a tech person, and new CEO Ben Collins, who is a former disinformation reporter. They kind of, the Onion was going to be up for sale, and so they bought it, and they bought it with the goal of like setting it free. And so since then, they have been set free, and they've brought back the print edition, which went away in 2013, but now it's back again. And I think people are really excited about that because lots of folks think the Onion works best in print. It's something you can hold in your hands, and it has a beginning and a middle and an end. And so now, of course, I subscribe right away. And now, I have a middle schooler who's an Onion fan. So
yeah. So there's still some hope that it could rise back to the glory days.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens. I mean, they're in a really difficult media environment like like everybody else. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah. We're going to get you out of here on this. I had, I've been a fan of the paper for quite since right out of college.
Yeah.
And always thought I could write for them. I've got some headlines I want to try on you, see what you think about them. Give me your true thumbs up, thumbs down. Boring interview leads to spike in PBS ratings. Yes, no.
I don't know. Yeah.
Long haul trucker happy for rising gas prices.
Yeah.
Long haul trucker adds 19th wheel.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Mother Nature oversleeps and forgets to start winter.
That's making me think of like Greek mythology, right? Isn't that
Cheese curds beat warm buttermilk in Super Bowl. That made Alma laugh, my camera person.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah.
Fake newspaper contains artificially enhanced language.
They're fighting against that, actually. It's in their contract. They're like unionized, no AI.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Keep it real. 100% real. State Street renamed Stumbling Boulevard at bar time. Reporter's headline causes Onion to tear up.
Oh,
I
interesting.
like that one myself because I wrote that one. Company holds meeting to schedule upcoming meeting.
That might actually be an Onion headline.
Oh, no way. I wrote that yesterday. PBS interview leads to quicker and longer sleep time.
But for who?
That's the question.
Yeah.
And we'll leave it there.
Okay.
Christine Wins, thank you so much for joining us on In Focus.
Thanks, Merv. It was great to be here.